Hey guys, welcome to the Stefan Livera podcast. This is episode 6, and my guest today is Michael Goldstein. Hi Michael, how are you?
Hey Stefan, it's great to talk to you.
Great. All right guys, so Michael, aka Bitstein, he's a very well-known guy in this space. He is the president and co-founder of the Nakamoto Institute, which I highly recommend you guys go and read. And if you're new, I recommend you go and read the crash course in Bitcoin political economy. Michael is also the co-host of Noted podcast alongside Pierre Rochard, which in my view is basically one of the best podcasts in this space. So if you haven't already heard that, definitely go and subscribe to that. And he's also the curator of justmeet.co. So yeah, we're very lucky to have Michael on. He's one of the top guys in this space. And what I was hoping to do today is actually basically critique a Paul Krugman article which came out on the 31st of July, and it's called Transaction Costs and Tethers, Why I'm a Crypto Skeptic. But before we launch into the detail, Michael, maybe you want to just talk about some of your prior interaction with Paul Krugman.
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, this goes back years because Paul Krugman is sort of the avatar of everything that's wrong, according to the Austrian economist. So, by the way, shout out to Robert Murphy and Tom Woods for setting the stage for a good Contra Krugman episode with all what they've done over the years. But basically, this guy he's the establishment incarnate, and I think his first mention of Bitcoin was let's say, was it 2014? It's been a while now.
Check.
Yeah, no, 2013. It was December 28th, 2013, when Bitcoin was $717 or so. And he titled a blog post, "Bitcoin is Evil." Now, that was actually probably one of the better Bitcoin skeptics articles, because he was completely honest about what Bitcoin represents. He wasn't trying to necessarily say that it can't work based on some technical reason or whatever. He just understood that if Bitcoin succeeds as money, it completely obviates his entire worldview, his entire career, everything about him. And so, understandably, to him, Bitcoin is evil. And that's exactly why Bitcoin is not evil. So that's been going on. And then, he continued to go on. There was another, I don't remember if it was a blog post or just a set of tweets, but he called Bitcoin a cult. I put out a tweet with a damning picture of the man that said, "This is what a no-coiner looks like." Not too long later, Vice had interviewed me about this so-called Bitcoin carnivore phenomenon, because nothing is more interesting than my lunch. And he shared that article on his Twitter, and shared a quote of mine. The quote was, "Bitcoin is a revolt against fiat money, and an all-meat diet is a revolt against fiat food." And he said, when I called Bitcoin a cult, I understated things. So, of course, I immediately printed this out and put it on my wall, and I look at it every day, and it gives me inspiration. But, this has just been going on for years. And let's also remember that this was the guy who said that the internet, this was back in, I think, 95 or so. He said the internet was basically going to turn out about as important as the fax machine. He also had the whole idea of the $1 trillion coin to solve the economy. There was that one time he got on and was talking about if only we could fake an alien invasion, it would stimulate the economy, and everything would be fixed. And my personal favorite, and unfortunately so, it disgusts me that someone would even have this view, but post 9/11, he had a column that said that, hey, well, at least it stimulates the economy, which is about the most egregious example of the broken window fallacy I've ever seen. So this guy, he is, he's a handful.
That's right. He is an avowed inflationist. So let's break down some of the comments he makes in this article. So I think the headline statement is basically, he says, it comes down to two things: transaction costs and the absence of tethering. So did you have any comments on that part, Michael?
Well, I mean, this is, it makes sense from his point of view, sort of. I mean, the transaction costs, I understand where he's coming from. He's trying to talk about the cost of payments. So he sees that right now, if you want to go purchase a good from a merchant using Bitcoin, there's a lot of transaction costs. For instance, if you don't already have Bitcoins, you have to go find someone who's willing to sell you Bitcoins. You have to acquire the Bitcoins. Then you have to go to the merchant. You have to pay them with Bitcoin. And you're going to have to wait for a block. It's going to take 10 minutes at least. And that's just to get one confirmation. If it's a higher value transaction, you're going to want more confirmations. Then on top of that, sorry, I lost my train of thought.
That you would have to then, go on.
Oh, well, and then on top of that, the cost of a Bitcoin transaction has just, we've seen it go up so high. And so it's not like, you just swipe the credit card and that's it. So he's thinking of transaction costs on that. This is fundamentally mistaken by thinking of Bitcoin as a Visa competitor. It's also mistaken because the costs of basically he's viewing money simply as a method of payment rather than a generalized understanding of medium of exchange. So what Bitcoin is trying to replace is not Visa, which is effectively like a sort of layer 3 technology, so to speak, on top of the dollar network. It's trying to replace that base money. So what he really needs to be looking at, if you want to make these kinds of comparisons, are what are the transaction costs regarding transferring on the sort of Fed wire level. And in this, it's also, I am not in the banking industry. I can't tell you right now how much it costs to, transfer, not just through ACH, but something way below, But the transaction costs are much more qualitative in the sense that there's trust issues involved, which have been routinely damaged. And none of these organizations have any shred of reputation whatsoever, if they had any ever. And there's also just the fragility thing, which is like, yeah, you might have like a low cost, but this thing might also blow up at any moment. And that kind of uncertainty is an extremely high transaction cost. The problem is, that's not something that you will necessarily see directly in the price of it. So I think he fundamentally misunderstands sort of these fragility arguments and the trust nature, which is why, as we discuss later, he doesn't even understand what problem Bitcoin solves.
That's right. That's right. And I think he's essentially ignoring all of in making the wrong comparative. He's comparing apples with oranges, and he's not comparing, like, what would be a better comparison, for example, might be comparing the cost of a Lightning Network transaction, which can be, 1 Satoshi. So, which is, a tiny, tiny fraction of a US cent.
And not only that, with a Lightning transaction, it's way more private than a credit card transaction. So, when you have to remember, every time you swipe a credit card, you're giving up tons of private information. I've had a number of issues with my credit card that thankfully JP Morgan and Bank of America and all these guys, they're pretty good at handling this stuff by now. But you're putting up major risk by even engaging in credit cards. Meanwhile, when you make a Lightning transaction, you just you just send the transaction and it's done, and you don't have to give up any bit of information except for the money. and perhaps your specific address if there's a need to ship something.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, yeah, it ultimately just comes back to Krugman making the wrong comparative and then trying to hold it to a standard that's just not reasonable for the underlying settlement layer network of Bitcoin, as Safedine explains it. I think the next thing to go into is just his comment at a broad level around what he says, the absence of tethering. And to offer some quick commentary, I think this is stemming from a mischaracterization of what government fiat money is. It stems from a misunderstanding of money's purpose, as described by Carl Menger, which is the most saleable or the most liquid good. And so it's just a flawed understanding of why we use money in the first place.
Yeah, no, is he basically trying to say, when he's saying tethering, is he saying that it needs to be backed by something, or that there needs to be a different use for money as well that sort of underplays the entire value proposition? Like when people say that gold is good as money because it's jewelry.
Yeah, so I think he is referring to using it, like having some kind of some other use for it. And I think in his case, he's thinking, oh, the US dollar is backstopped by the fact that the US government will accept it for tax payments.
Yes, yeah. So he's basically, of course, yeah. Fiat guys are often just app coiners, where the US dollar is their shitcoin app coin for a terribly broken governance model. It's yet another one of these scams. Yeah, because it would be ironic if he meant that in the sort of it's not backed by a sort of physical good. Which, although I guess you're saying it is backed by a physical good, saying that it's the military, just fiat.
Yeah, so I think as I read it, yeah, go on.
Oh, well, it's just fiat is it's fiat because it's based on decree, so it's literally backed so to speak by nothing.
Yeah, it's the chartalist, state view. So he sort of puts out both of them in this article, as I can tell. So he's saying, ultimately, it's backstopped by the fact that the US government will accept dollars as a payment of tax liabilities. And then later on, he tries to go on to talk about how gold, and he says, oh, most gold just sits there, but gold does have real-world uses for jewelry and filling teeth and so on, which provides, in his words, a weak but real tether to the real economy. Okay. And then he says, cryptocurrencies, by contrast, have no backstop, no tether.
Right. Okay. So in this case, he is meaning what he's meaning by tethering is the second one that I was saying, which is that you believe that a money needs some other good. But yes, this is a complete affront to the sort of Mengerian view, which, as you said, is just about being the most liquid saleable good, and having some other use might be good for the purpose of bootstrapping a currency. There needs to be some original reason, or rather, we know by virtue of something being a money that at some point someone had a reason to demand it. So, likely speaking, one of the reasons they may have demanded it was because they happened to think that it was useful for something else. And then over time, as more people demanded it, it became that liquid good. But just with many things, Bitcoin obviates this physicality that we so long thought money had to deal with, and even many Austrians. And it's really focused on the scarcity. That's really what we understand now, thanks to Bitcoin illuminating, or helping us elucidate better ideas. It really has nothing to do with anything but the scarcity that can create, something, and create a sort of moneyness, and a reason to want to hold, give something liquidity and saleability, at least once it's bootstrapped into the money.
Yep, that's right. And then, so the next section, he says, okay, set against this history, the enthusiasm for cryptocurrencies seems very odd because it goes exactly in the opposite of the long-run trend. Did you want to comment on the real long-run trend there, Michael?
Yes, yeah, this is it's funny. I think this is, kind of 20th century brain damage on a lot of ideas. There's so much stuff in the modern world that we like to think of ourselves as enlightened humans because, we use money that's apparently only good because we have people with pointing guns at us to use it, and we drink Soylent and all this other stuff. We think of ourselves as the brilliant, everyone else throughout history was stupid compared to us. Well, it turns out, like many things, so much of what we see in the modern world, in the 20th century and so on, is a historical aberration. And when we look at money, gold has been monetized since antiquity. You can find Roman coins made in gold and all throughout the world, even. Except for in places where it was like truly not scarce. I think there were a couple places in the Western Hemisphere where they just had so much gold that it would seem kind of silly to monetize it for the very reason that everyone else wanted to monetize it. But in any case, the history of money seemed to point towards a culmination of the end of the 18th century, 19th century, where the entire world had sort of converged on a global gold standard. And so then, governments did everything they could, worked with the banks to chip away at this and create our fiat hedge, this fiat system that we live in. And I see that as total aberration. And when you take that out of the story, when you take this paper money, and by the way, like, you go back a little bit of time, paper money was seen as such a like an assault on human reason. I love it's of course just a television show or something. There's a clip of from an old Marco Polo show where Marco Polo comes back from China and shows them, paper money to the I believe it was the Pope and a bunch of cardinals, and one of the cardinals gets his hands on it and is just talking about how silly, like, this isn't the good. Like, you think this is a title to some good, but it's nothing. It's just a piece of paper. And then he lights it on fire and it's reduced to nothing. And then there was a great quote. Well, I mean, going a little further, like Faust Part 2 by Goethe, is the deal with the devil is literally like paper money. Like, I can make you rich by giving this paper money, but you also have like made this deal with the economic devil. And then going forward, I also know there's quotes from people like Thomas Paine and other, American revolutionaries and such that, basically wanted the death penalty for someone who advocated for paper money. So that seems like actually the completely normal human response to the very notion of having a fiat currency. So take out the 20th century, and I see Bitcoin as the, natural continuation of this progress. It fits right into the story of, when you see rhinestones and you see beads and you see, and metals and gold and all this. I think anyone who's read Saifedean's book, has seen this history and can easily see how Bitcoin fits right into that story. But for Krugman, the story of progress is the one in which, whatever he says is correct. And so when you can create a world in which his opinions matter more by saying, ridiculous economic statements, he does prefer that, and he sees that as progress. But the rest of us either do think differently or probably should think differently.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's sort of as you were just discussing there, it reminded me of your kind of indirect exchange there with Krugman, where it's the parallel of fiat food and fiat money. It's like fiat money is like is the real fad diet here.
Yes,
the long run money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's kind of like how paleo food. In general, not just my particular crazy brand, but in general has been maligned as a fad diet, when the whole notion of it is, let's eat how people have as far as we know have always eaten, and yet in that case it's more of a 10,000 year scale where they view as the aberration. but it's also talking about a 2 million year time span. So it's very much the same. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, cool. So the next section, he says, so Krugman says, we have high costs of doing business because transferring a Bitcoin or other cryptocurrency unit requires providing a complete history of past transactions. So I think here, Krugman doesn't really even understand how Bitcoin or Bitcoin clients work. Did you want to outline a little bit about that, around maybe light clients, prune clients, and then some other points?
Yeah, so there's a couple things to say about this, and even some steel manning that I want to do, which is, yeah, like, you and I have talked in conversation that the fact that, even if you don't have a full node, you still have keys, and you can still produce a transaction that is perfectly valid on the chain and can find its way into the chain, meaning that, you don't need the complete history in order to simply produce this. That being said, to steelman it, if you actually want to know that you actually own these coins, and you actually want to know that when you make that transaction, it actually makes it into the chain that everyone has consensus on, then yes, you do need a full node. There's a problem. SPV, as Satoshi envisioned in the white paper, has just failed to come to fruition for a number of reasons. But that being said, like a lot of people are able to interact with the Bitcoin network, perhaps in a slightly trusted manner, without quite the high costs he's talking about. And even then, like really the high costs, like I've been working on BTC Pay server, like setting one up and stuff, and it's extremely easy. It's actually really, really easy if you have just a little bit of technical skills. And if you don't have technical skills, they have even easier ways that you can deploy it. So the costs of that are going to be, there are some costs for the month for hosting. And because of the large amount of data, because of the blockchain, it is a little higher amount of, the hosting costs. You can expect to pay a good, $60 a month or so. So yes, like if you really want that, but is $60 a month really that much when you compare it to the kind of fees that you have to pay with Visa? And additionally, the other fees associated with these things. So a business that is running that, they don't have to deal with chargebacks and fraud of the same sort. They don't have to be liable for the fact that they're taking people's private information. I mean, not only as a consumer do you want to feel unsafe about giving people, your credit card, even though we kind of all have to, as a business, you need to make sure that like, okay, well, am I doing processing with a company that's PCI compliant and all that, to make sure like my customers, don't get hacked. Like think of, how embarrassing, what are the costs for Targets when their credit card stuff got breached? That's an extremely high cost, and these types of things can be helped to be avoided with Bitcoin. So once again, this is classic Keynesian thinking. In this case, by virtue of the fact that Krugman has no ability to see the unseen costs of the world around him. He is only able to look at something and see, Bitcoin isn't impossibly free. It's not $0, and therefore it's extremely expensive or whatever, when the unseen costs like that you deal with using any other system are so much higher and so much greater. So I really think that Krugman needs to go back and read some Bastiat to kind of just get back to the fundamentals before he'll even ever possibly understand Bitcoin.
Yeah, agreed. It's like that concept that the cost of one money standard, the opportunity cost of one money standard, is not using another more sound money standard. And in neglecting this comparison, that's where Krugman is basically making the error.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next,
I'd like to point out,
go on.
It's something that I had reached back in my mind, thinking of stuff I've learned from the Mises Institute, going to Mises University and such, there's a concept in economics. And I mean, you can apply it elsewhere than just economics, but here we see it a lot, of things like the what's called the nirvana fallacy. What the nirvana fallacy is looking at the world and seeing that it does not match your own sort of preconceived, almost utopian vision of how it ought to be, and therefore it's flawed. The most common place you'll see this in economics is just the fact that neoclassical economists in general will use economic concepts and constructs such as perfect competition. And so they look out in the world and they see that there is not perfect competition. And therefore, anything that happens on the market, or, the market, someone isn't able to buy something at the price that they wish they could buy it at. Well, there wasn't perfect competition, and therefore there was some kind of market failure. And so likewise here, if you think, what does he think? Does he think that Bitcoin needs to be absolutely costless? Because that's, as long as we're dealing in a universe that has, matter and energy and time, nothing is costless. And so it's really disingenuous, and it's a nirvana fallacy to compare, Bitcoin to this, as opposed to what you should be doing in economics, which is looking at a choice and comparing it to its alternatives.
Yeah, that's a great articulation there. Totally agree with that. Okay, and then the next section, he says, governments have occasionally abused the privilege of creating fiat money. I mean, occasionally? Let's try all the time eventually. And then this is not even considering the impact of the boom bust cycle that inflationists cause. Did you have any comments on that?
I mean, it's a good stand-up bit, I suppose. That idea, but like, yeah. So first of all, it's hilarious to think that it's only occasional abuse, because I mean, obviously this is an audio podcast, so we can't just show a bunch of graphs. But I want anyone who's listening to go look at maybe what would you say, like M3 money supply graph would probably be the best to look at. Just see the incredible rise, especially in the 70s after closing the gold window. But then especially when you get to 2007, 2008, when the government had to put out trillions of dollars to deal with the mess, the housing bubble that Krugman was asking for and pushing for. So yeah, the idea that governments only occasionally abuse this privilege is absolutely ridiculous. Throughout history, banks have always tried to fractionally reserve money and inflate the money supply at any chance they got. There's so much to say about this. Like, even if the government was, able to restrain itself, the way he imagines they can. So, because what he says in this was something about how, when you look at Fed bankers and stuff, they actually usually are restraining themselves because they don't want to go out of business or whatever. And I actually don't even think that that's necessarily wrong. Like, you do, if you want to keep up this con for the long run, you do have to boil the frog slowly. You can't just print all the money now. You have to make sure that you kind of keep everyone from noticing a problem, so that there isn't a crack up boom and you have hyperinflation. So I kind of believe that. But even if they're doing their jobs perfectly, they like to speak of 1 or 2% inflation being a sort of target goal for society. They'll use reasons about like the growing economy and all that. I think it's really just they looked at the charts and decided that 2% of the economy should be their paycheck. But in any case, like even if they only had 1% inflation, anyone needs to remember that means that 50% of your wealth has been devalued after 36 years. And that is incredibly bad for acting as a savings vehicle. You cannot put your money under a mattress if in 50 years you expect it to just, I mean, in 36 years, expect it to be 50% worth 50% less. Now, perhaps if we at the end of this found that there was literally no better way to do money, then perhaps that's an okay trade-off. But I have zero reason to believe that's the case because of what we understand about gold and Bitcoin and all these alternative monies. And therefore, I don't see that as an argument. And I just see that as a sign of, really bad shitcoin. And on top of this, it means that Krugman has no sense, once again, of the fragility of the system. Because even if they're trying to restrain themselves, when you are trying to play God and control the economy, because this is basically the Fed is effectively like the wizard in the Wizard of Oz. Behind the curtain is just a person trying to pull all these levers because they believe that they know the economy and they can control the economy to their will. Now, this is an affront to what we know about what the economy really is. It's a very organic process, and it's a very complex process. So when you're trying to pull all these levers in such a complex process, you are creating a much more fragile system. And this is where black swans will kill you. So, plenty of people saw the housing crisis, that bust coming. Plenty of people saw many other crises coming to an end. But these people don't necessarily, which is why they are okay with pumping it in the first place. And so without that sense of the black swan events, these fat tails, everything that Nassim Taleb talks about, you actually have a harder time putting that restraint on yourself because you don't fully understand the possibilities of just how bad things can go wrong. And Bitcoin, thankfully, obviates all of this because it already has the perfect monetary policy, and it has one that cannot be messed with. But unfortunately, the bankers and Krugman do not play by that, which is why we need Bitcoin in the first place. The other, of course, as a sort of Keynesian and stuff, he believes that monetary policy is a tool to mitigate the effects of business cycles and other economic shocks and stuff like that. While poor monetary policy, is actually the cause of these business cycles. So they don't understand that when you're back there pulling all those levers, you're actually setting the stage for these business cycles. I of course recommend anyone go read, Rothbard. What's it called? Economic Cycles.
What has government done to our money?
That one.
Oh, yep. Economic Cycles Before the Fed is a good talk by Tom Woods on that as well.
Yeah, and then I think it's Economic Cycles, their Cause and Cure or something like that. Is that what it's? I'm totally blanking on it. And then, of course, there's Money, Bank Credit, and Economic Cycles by Huerta de Soto, which is sort of, the Bible and long enough to be so on this topic. Anyway, the point being that, all the problems that they're trying to fix, you can just avoid in the first place if you don't act like you can be pulling these levers at all. And Bitcoin pulls the wizard from behind the curtain and puts up an iron curtain so no one else can go in there and touch anything.
Yep. Yeah, that's kind of ultimately that's really what the problem we're solving. We're solving, the inflationist ideology, and that by simply creating more tickets to money that we can become richer, which is just wrong. By returning to hard or sound money, the world will become more prosperous.
Yeah, there was a great
let's move on. Go on.
There was a great quote from the Property and Freedom Society where Hans Hermann Hoppe is trying to talk about how you can explain these things to Krugman, and he says how you just have to talk to him like he's a kindergartner and just ask him just slowly and quietly, how does producing more paper dollars increase your wealth? And when you really, anyone who stops and thinks about that should hopefully quickly understand why that makes no sense. But unfortunately, that people don't seem to do that because they've benefited from not understanding that.
Yeah, great point. I remember, I know that video. I know the one you're talking about. I think it's like a very short, there's a 2-minute clip on YouTube. I'll find it and I'll put it in the show notes for this episode. Okay, and then so the next point here is, I mean, he's sort of going into the typical kind of canards that people who don't like Bitcoin, the typical arguments they make. So he's saying the purchasing power of $1 a year from now is highly predictable, orders of magnitude more predictable than that of a Bitcoin. So ultimately, it's just a big straw man. He's just basically critiquing Bitcoin because it's new. It's only 9 years old, and it's a drop in the bucket compared to everything else in the world. So it's only going to seem, unstable in this short period of adoption. Well, it might take a while. But did you have any comments on that, Michael?
Yeah, well, I mean, that basically that covers a lot of it. It's just the fact that, once again, I don't know if this would be a nirvana fallacy per se, but it's basically like, you think it has to have already succeeded to have succeeded. And yeah, these things take time. It's actually when you really step back and think about what Bitcoin has achieved, it's absolutely amazing. Someone created, digital internet money on scratch in an obscure corner of the internet. And now it has a market cap of $150 billion. And it's a worldwide phenomenon that gains headlines, and Nobel Prize winning economists feel the need to comment on it. Like that's incredible, So to think that, because right now it's a little volatile is somehow a problem. If anything, it means you should invest because, if you're someone like me who thinks, Bitcoin has a long ways to go, then the volatility is good. If it wasn't volatile, it would have meant that it already reached its equilibrium. I don't believe that's the case. And so it has so much room to grow, and investors can profit off that. It's so small, it's very illiquid. This thing that I don't even know when Bitcoin will stop being volatile. People use this as an argument all the time. But look, like right now, like given this fact that we think that it can be hyper monetized, this is where, hyper Bitcoinization and all of that moves us from $140 billion to what, 90 trillion or something in terms of kind of relative purchasing power. So it has to get there. And then we don't even know if it'll stop there because, Pierre did a great job of really pointing this out. When we compare the potential of Bitcoin to gold or fiat, we're underselling it because gold was, only so good as a money. It was a very good money, but, it has its flaws. Like it's not as scarce as Bitcoin. It has extremely high storage costs and all this. Fiat money, I mean, need I go on about all the problems with fiat money, but, clearly Bitcoin is a better money than fiat money. Or I shouldn't say clearly because apparently it's not to some people. But, I believe Bitcoin is a better money than fiat. And thus, why should I expect that a world powered on Bitcoin would only be as wealthy as a world powered on fiat? So if that's the case, like, I don't even know where the upper bound of Bitcoin is. I actually think that, with the fiat comparisons and gold comparisons, that's more of a lower bound of what Bitcoin is possible. So we're talking about like a massive amount of economic growth to be found. And to get from here to there, it literally has to be unstable. You can't have a stable jump. There's not going to be nothing is going to act in such a linear fashion that's going to anything in the real world would go in a perfectly linear fashion.
Yep. Yep.
Did you have a point?
No, go on.
No, I mean, it's just a dear you have to say, but
Okay. Yeah. Sure. Okay. Well, the next thing Paul talks about is how he's saying, okay, look, it's been 8 years after Bitcoin was launched, and cryptocurrencies have made very few inroads into actual commerce. Only a few firms will accept them as payment. I think this just fundamentally is misunderstanding the hyper-Bitcoinization thesis. Why would people want to spend their Bitcoin now anyway? It only makes sense to really do this post-hyper-Bitcoinization. So I think ultimately he's just putting the merchant adoption and acceptance, ahead of everything else, and he's basically putting the cart before the horse.
Absolutely, and this ties into that other thing too. Is this is also part of why Bitcoin will sort of see that growth as more people demanding it as a store of value that lower increases that sort of lower bound by hodlers of last resort and such. But I think that the Keynesian thinking that's shining through there is the idea that money needs the sort of circular flow. And so if you don't have people accepting money as payments, or rather, actually, I mean, here I would say, I don't even think the problem, I think, if he wants to steal man, he shouldn't even be focused on the fact that firms will accept them as payment, because I think firms would accept Bitcoin as payment if people wanted to pay in Bitcoins. It would be silly for a company to have people wanting to give them, oh, we can make millions of dollars in revenue, but we have to accept Bitcoin. So we're going to only accept a couple $1,000s in revenue by accepting fiat. Like no firm would do that, right? So what you should really be looking at is the fact that it's like, well, no one wants to spend their Bitcoins. And that's where the lack of velocity is coming from. The problem is like that does not actually tell us whether or not a currency is going to succeed at becoming money, because that's not something that comes now. Of course, people don't want to spend it. They want to use money as a medium of exchange, where medium of exchange is over the long run. They want to trade future value for present value. That is, they believe that in the future, Bitcoin will be widely demanded. And so they want to profit off that instead of just giving up their Bitcoins now. And they want to put money into savings. I know Safe has gone on a lot about the sort of differences between savings and investments and all that. But basically, this is what it is because everyone wants to just hoard. Keynesians don't understand that is a productive act. To save money is and they call it hoarding. It's really just saving. To save money is a productive act because you're hedging against a future uncertainty. And even at the fundamental level, just like going back to the fundamentals of Austrian economics, you have the action axiom. Humans act purposefully. Well, if someone's saving money, they're not trying to do that just because they think it's fun or whatever. It's because they think that it brings a profit to them. They think that there will be future opportunities that give them more than whatever they can spend that money on now. So it's a completely productive thing. But they view it as not productive, because if you're not putting the money into the economy, so to speak, then people aren't investing in jobs, and then everyone goes hungry because they don't want to spend money on food, and that whole deflationary spiral argument spirals out of that. So once again, it's basically he thinks there needs to be circular flow and velocity, and we say no. There's a productive reason why people want to save, and it's that very fact that more and more people want to save that shows us that Bitcoin has a very strong future.
Yeah, no, great articulation there. It's around basically having a sufficiently developed theory of capital and understanding that capital accumulation is how civilization grows and prospers rather than being consumption driven, which is that sort of Keynesian Krugmanite mindset. Yeah. And then so the next topic is basically Krugman trying to smear Bitcoin and say, oh, what's all that cash holding about? We all know the answer. It's tax evasion and illicit activity, and cryptocurrencies are just competing for some of that same business. So again, this is just some of the old sort of smear arguments and not paying attention to the superiority of Bitcoin's monetary policy.
Yes, although at least I'm happy here that he admits that holding cash is a productive activity. It's just that he doesn't like some of the productive things that it brings people. And productive in this case, I'm not arguing for tax evasion or illicit activity, but people do it because it brings them some sort of profit. But so he's admitting that. But yeah, I mean, it's weird to say this in 2018 when the Silk Road was taken down in, what was it, late 2013. You know, and when the Silk Road was taken down, we had a flash crash, and then we saw Bitcoin quickly rise to its all-time high at the time, which to me was a strong market signal that Bitcoin's use in drugs is actually like marginal. So it's actually very strange. That's I think an empirically false statement to make. And it's, you know, Bitcoin's you know, if you do decide that certain activities that are either frowned upon or not legal in certain jurisdictions, if that's what you want to use Bitcoin for, you might want to look into, you know, other methods such as using the United States dollar, like it's traditionally done, because of the public nature of it. Although, you know, hopefully Krugman will help out with you know, some coin join schemes and technologies to you know, help with these things. But yeah, once again, he doesn't understand that maybe you would just want to save money for the future. That's actually a perfectly reasonable thing for any decent human to want in life, is just to be able to save money for the future. And that doesn't seem to make any sense to him.
Yeah, it could just be that he is unable to relate to the average man in the street, so to speak. You know, where everyone else in the world, most people feel some level of uncertainty. They don't have sort of this very highly paid, prestigious position and a certain position in society that other people don't have, and that, you know, really we need to save money because we face uncertainty in this world, and we need it to help us deal with that. So yeah, I think we'll sort of wrap up the last segment of the Krugman article, and basically he says, oh, so that's why I'm a crypto skeptic. Could I be wrong? Of course. And I think we both would agree that he is wrong, and he has been wrong, as you said, since December 28, 2013, when the price was $717. And as we make this podcast, the price is 7,446. So we're talking over 10 times what he said.
Yeah. Oh, one last thing that I'd like to mention about Krugman is this whole point about, you know, we touched on this, but the whole men with guns thing. He thinks that that's a viable backing for a currency. But I'd like to point out that there have been many fiat currencies in jurisdictions that have had, you know, armies, and yet it still collapsed. You know, the system is still fragile no matter how you look at it. It doesn't matter that there's a guy with a gun. You still need to pay that guy with a gun, by the way, with something. That guy's going to want to save money for future uncertainty as well. So, you know, we've seen Weimar Germany hyperinflate. We've seen Venezuela hyperinflate. We've seen all these places hyperinflate and have their currencies collapse. And they have plenty of men with guns there. So that is a poor backing for the app coin that is the United States dollar.
Exactly right. Yeah, so I think it's basically that the chartalist view is you can only go so far with that men with guns concept. Eventually, you've got to pay the postman, and that's what happens in many cases, as you said, with Venezuela, Argentina, Iran, Zimbabwe, Germany, all big prominent examples in history and from modern day. Okay, so I think let's just touch on a couple other topics. I think one thing that's happening now in the Bitcoin space is a lot of the altcoiners come out and say, "Oh, you guys, you Bitcoiners, you just call everything a scam." Like, not everything is a scam. And I think this is a topic we've discussed, which is around the scammer heuristic with crypto. You know, that maybe not everything is literally a BitConnect scam, but many things are scam-ish. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I wrote an article that's literally everyone's a scammer. So when people say, "Oh, well, not everything's a scam," it's like, no, literally everything's a scam. And I highly recommend people read the article and try to read it carefully, because I think it actually is one of my best sort of elucidations of sort of the maximalist position on these things. And apparently in a way that a lot of people didn't quite pick up on first reading, probably because of they think the title's hyperbolic or whatever. But, the key thing in this case, when people say that, they need to understand about this scam concept, is just the fact, first of all, when I speak, I'm assuming that hyper-Bitcoinization is a sort of reality. Like, it's happening right now, and it's going to continue happening. So given that, what are the ways in which you need to approach the world? And one of the things is, well, you have this resource that, in your opinion, is extremely undervalued. So if anyone is trying to get you to give them up, perhaps they're trying to scam you out of your future wealth. And so the scammer heuristic is basically saying, treat everything as a scam where someone is trying to trick you out of your long-term potential wealth because they want it, and until it's proven otherwise. I'm not against people spending their Bitcoins if there's something they really want. If all you wanted in life was a Lambo and you have enough money for a Lambo now, go get the Lambo. There's nothing wrong with that. But if after this whole process, for a lot of us, I think Bitcoin has really made us think more about our own time preferences and adjust accordingly, and think about our future selves and what we truly want in life, what we truly value. Because of that, there's actually a lot of things that it's much harder to sell me things, quite honestly. Even if sorry, I lost my train of thought. A little thing popped up on the screen. Even if I wanted to spend my Bitcoins, there's not necessarily as much stuff that I actually want to do. So, and of course, when it comes to these altcoins, they really are scams, because none of them are offering me a sound money alternative to the US dollar that's quite as powerful as Bitcoin is. They're not decentralized as much.
Great articulation there.
Strong monetary policy, et cetera, et cetera. They're just not Bitcoin. So they're scams.
Yeah. So I think, and then that's the other thing that comes up, I think, online. There's a lot of discussion about, Bitcoin maximalism. Is Bitcoin maximalism descriptive or is it prescriptive? Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah. So I think of Bitcoin maximalism as first and foremost a descriptive statement about monetary economics. It looks at the world, and we're trying to make an honest assessment of the nature of monetary competition and network effects, and what our conclusions are. And it's one that's been around. Like, this is no new idea. It's not like Bitcoin maximalists made up this idea, but it's basically that one currency, one good, will tend to dominate. The whole point of money is you want the most saleable and liquid good. And so one currency, one good will gain that spot as the most saleable and liquid good. And everything else will at best be sort of niche. This is sort of given free market conditions, which, because Bitcoin is as it is, legal tender laws have no ability to stop it. So it creates its own free market conditions. So because of that, we also look at, the importance of monetary policy and all the stuff that SAFE talks about, stock to flow ratio, the scarcity, et cetera. And because of that, Bitcoin has the best monetary policy. And thus we come to the, sort of positive economic conclusion that Bitcoin is likely the best, money, and Bitcoin will be that thing. Now, where the prescriptive stuff comes in is related to what I was saying, is once you've come to that conclusion, how do you go about looking at the world? And one of the things is, you start thinking, well, everything's kind of a scam. And so you start sort of developing community norms around, like, hey, don't scam people, don't one that's coming up is, don't concern troll Bitcoin. Or if you have a problem, people expect you to come up with a solution, or present your criticism in a constructive manner, as opposed to having this sort of winking tone where it's like, oh, let's throw away everything and come up with our better scheme, which also happens to give me a founder's reward, or pre-mine, or whatever scheme there is that enriches you. So a lot of sort of different norms come up around this. I think Giacomo is really good at enumerating all of these kinds of stuff, but that's where the dichotomy is. Our economic statements about what we believe in terms of Bitcoin winning, that is totally, we're trying to be descriptive. If you have disagreements with our logic, you can say that, but it's not meant to be a sort of prescriptive. We're not against other currencies existing. We're saying that because of how monetary economics works, one will win, and we happen for these reasons to believe that Bitcoin will be that one that wins.
Yeah, great way of explaining it. I like that. That's great. And then I think the last thing, the other thing around developers and the philosophy of development. So you've previously commented about the UNIX philosophy, which has a few principles. Did you want to outline some of those?
Yes. Well,
and how they're applied to Bitcoin, obviously.
I think the UNIX developers were sort of the Stoic philosophers of the 20th century. You can gather some brilliant thinking from these guys. I highly recommend people, check out Eric Raymond's The Art of Unix Programming. It's on the Nakamoto Institute. Some of the stuff, there's things like, about keep it simple. Everything is meant to be sort of lightweight tools. Actually, probably a more famous thing is like, you want to write programs that do one thing and do it well. So in Unix, what this means is that you don't have a giant program that does literally everything under the sun. What you have instead are little utilities that other programs can chain together to do other things. So it's very modular. You have a program. Just giving some very, very basic examples, but like ls, that's what you would type into the command line, like ls and then a directory, and it just lists the files in a directory. Then what you can do is use a pipe character and pipe that output into another program that maybe parses it and looks for a certain pattern that you're looking for, and you have like a different tool for that, and that pipes into another one. And you keep kind of this chain of tools with inputs and outputs, and each program itself is focused on doing nothing but that one thing the best it can. And what this means is there are programs that were written in the 70s that everyone still uses today, and they're still like the best way to do a lot of things. And I actually see it as I feel like a failure when I realize that I wrote a whole Python script that I could have just done with a couple bash commands. So what does that mean for what we're talking about? Well, a lot of people want Bitcoin to include everything under the sun. So this is the original Bitcoin maximalist straw man was, they want every app to be on Bitcoin. But that's actually not at all what we want. I do not want Bitcoin to be bloated with a bunch of decentralized apps filling up block space with its data. I don't want to wake up in a world where I have to pay for the world to stream Netflix using blockchain data. Instead, the idea here is that the tool that we want is digital cash, and I want Bitcoin to zero in on that and do that one thing really, really well. And it does. So Bitcoin does not spend its time working on Netflix on the blockchain or all these other things that Ethereum people, and I shouldn't just pick on them. There's a whole bunch of other people who fall down this trap, including some Bitcoiners. Let's put social media on the blockchain, et cetera, et cetera. Instead, the Bitcoin investors have chosen a path, and the developers have taken up the cause of zeroing in on what do we need to do to secure Bitcoin, Bitcoin's ability to be a scarce digital money. And everything else is superfluous and should just be rightfully avoided.
Yep, great points there. And I think maybe you could just comment a little on how the modularity of development really helps developers who are just in their, say they're developing on one particular piece of software. They don't have to worry so much about what's going on in other parts of the program or other parts of the stack, so to speak.
Oh, exactly. I mean, to bring this to even a lower level, when you create an app coin or an ICO or whatever, you have to think about not just providing your product, whatever it might be. You also have to think about being the Federal Reserve. By coming up with the money rules, and it's absurd. Like you shouldn't be putting that work on yourself. So instead, yes, it's very good to have modules and layers such that a person just working on the UX layer for a wallet can just interact with an API so that they can sort of put everything, they can abstract everything away and put it into a black box and just focus on the one thing that they want to do well. That's very important. If you're doing Lightning development, you don't have to think about making sure that Bitcoin protocol is working as perfectly or whatever. You're just connecting to Bitcoin Core, or some of them do BTCD. You just assume that to be going well. Then if you're making a Lightning wallet, you don't have to know, you don't have to worry as much, like, is LND doing its job with actually handling the HTLC contracts or C Lightning or whatever you're using. Instead, you can focus purely on, okay, now that we have this thing, now that we have programmable scarce digital money, now we can think about creating hash time locked contracts. And then you can go to the next thing. It's like, well, now that we can assume we have working hash time locked contracts, what's the thing we can work on? And you can abstract these things away and focus on your little part of the your little garden in the ecosystem.
Yeah, fantastic points. I think the listeners will really get a lot of value out of that, especially the ones who are not as technical, and they can hopefully understand the difference in the way Bitcoiners and people building on Bitcoin approach things versus some of the altcoins, and why, the contrasting philosophies there. Okay, so I think that's basically all we've got time for. So we might just wrap up the discussion, guys. So you can find Michael on Twitter. His account is Bitstein, Bitstein. He is a highly recommended follow. Definitely go and check out the Nakamoto Institute, particularly the crash course in Bitcoin political economy if you're new. Michael is also available for consulting, so look him up, bitstein.org/consulting. Have you got anything else you'd like to bring up at this point, Michael?
Not really. I'm so honored that you brought me on. It's been a pleasure being Bitcoin friends with you for many years now. You've been putting out great content for years, especially from the accounting front and all that. So it's been real great, and I'm this podcast has already become one of the best podcasts in the space, competing with my very own, and I'm honored to say that. So you've just been doing a great job, and I'm so glad that you invited me on. I've had a real blast. It's amazing how quickly time passed while we're having this discussion.
Yeah, agreed. It was an honor to have you on, Michael. I think you've offered some really fantastic insights for the listeners, and yeah, definitely I'll get you back on sooner or later. We'll try and make this a regular thing. Okay, guys. So I'll just wrap up then. So look up this page on my website, stefanlivera.com. This episode will be SLP6, and I'll put all the links, the relevant links, such as the Krugman column, Michael's article on scammers, the Nakamoto Institute, Michael's Twitter, a few other bits and pieces, as we've discussed. And just lastly, if I could request that you guys, if you've enjoyed the discussion, please do give me a good rating on iTunes and on Stitcher, and share the podcast with your friends. That's it from us. Thanks very much, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.